All guitars are parts casters? If you're a guitar player, chances are you've heard the term parts caster, which means a guitar that was built, or rather assembled, from readily available individual parts. You can go to any number of online suppliers from Stuart McDonald to All Parts to Guitar Fetish or Amazon and purchase all the necessary parts to build your own electric guitar. But if you think about it, aren't all guitars just parts casters? Before the Industrial Revolution and the age of mass-produced musical instruments, guitars and other string instruments were made by a luthier. A luthier was an individual craftsperson who designed and hand-built string instruments. The oldest guitar manufacturer in the U.S. is, of course, Martin Guitars. They have been building guitars in the U.S. since 1833. If you were a guitar player in the U.S. before World War II, chances are you bought a Martin guitar. The Gibson Guitar Company began in 1894 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. But around the end of World War II, however, things began to change. It is said that the first electric guitar was invented in 1931 by Rickenbacker. It was no more than an acoustic guitar neck attached to a small round body with an electromagnetic pickup under the strings. Eventually, arch-top acoustic guitars were used and crude pickups were installed. It would be 10 years later in 1941 that Les Paul began experimenting with electric guitar designs, and another 10 years after that the Gibson Les Paul would become available to guitar players around the world. And in 1946, Leo Fender would begin building his iconic guitars, the Telecaster and Stratocaster. During these early days, electric guitars were designed and built by people that knew, at the very least, how the instrument worked. While Leo Fender wasn't really a guitar player himself, he was at least an engineer that worked with radios and eventually amplifiers. Gibson, of course, partnered up with jazz guitar legend Les Paul. Ted McCarty, the president of Gibson from 1950 to 1966, also designed many of Gibson's iconic guitars like the Gibson SG. The point is, the people running guitar companies back then didn't just push paper around and stare at the bottom line. They were actively involved in designing and developing the guitars. Iconic guitar brands like Fender and Gibson eventually became so popular that their instruments became some of the very first mass-produced electric guitars in the world. In fact, Leo Fender designed his Telecaster and Stratocaster guitars to be modular so that individual parts could be made on an assembly line. He made the process streamlined. His goal was to manufacture affordable, quality instruments, but also to make money. But even with this assembly line style manufacturing process, many human hands touched the guitars along the way. Machines were employed to make cutting and shaping the bodies easier and faster, but a human being was operating or manipulating those machines. These guitars were, for all intents and purposes, still handmade. Now consider how modern guitars are made. Wood blanks are glued together by maybe one or two people, using a machine to clamp the pieces together. Those pieces are sent to a CNC machine where the body and neck of the guitar is cut out, most likely to the final shape. A separate department might manufacture some of the metal parts like the bridge or neck plate. Some parts might not even be manufactured on site. Some parts may even be contracted by another company altogether. Each part in the process is handled by separate people and mostly done with machines. The person winding the pickups may never even see the guitar. At the end of the process is someone putting it all together. All the individual parts are made into a completed guitar, no different than if you or I bought a bunch of parts and made a guitar ourselves. Unless your guitar comes from a very small boutique builder, your guitar is a parts caster. So what makes a Fender a true Fender, or a Gibson a true Gibson? Gibson began building guitars in Kalamazoo, Michigan in the late 1800s. Some guy named Gibson started the company. Same goes for Fender. Leo Fender made the guitars that bear his name. Eventually Gibson moved to Nashville and the Heritage Guitar Company began building Les Paul style guitars in the actual place that the Les Paul was born, using some of Gibson's old machinery and Gibson's former employees. Wouldn't that make a Heritage Les Paul more of an authentic Les Paul than a Gibson at that point? Of course, now even the Heritage Guitar Company has CNC machines and manufactures guitars on an assembly line. So is a modern Fender guitar still a true Fender? Leo Fender passed away in 1991. He sold the Fender Guitar Company to CBS in 1965. Some of the most sought-after Fender guitars are the ones built before 1965. Are those the real Fenders? Some people don't even consider Fenders made in Mexico as real Fenders. Leo Fender would go on to form G&L Guitars. Maybe G&L are true Fender guitars. How far from the parent DNA does a guitar have to get before it's only a Fender or Gibson in name only? I can go to Fender's website right now, buy a Fender made in USA neck that says right on it, Fender Stratocaster. I can buy a Fender made body and all the necessary hardware to build a Fender Stratocaster directly from the Fender company. The exact same parts that go into an actual Fender guitar. Put it all together, but no one will think that what I put together is a real Fender Stratocaster. Yet that's basically what happens at the factory in Corona, California. Parts being put together. A parts caster. I bought a used made in Mexico Fender last year from a local guitar shop. At first I thought it might be a fake because the specs didn't match any guitar I could find online. Eventually I discovered that the pickups were replaced with a higher end Fender loaded pick guard. I can't tell you how many people said that my guitar was no longer an actual Fender Stratocaster because someone changed out the pick guard and pickups, with actual Fender products mind you. People felt that the guitar was now a parts caster. So what makes a Fender a Fender? Is it more than the name on the headstock? If an employee from Fender quits, starts their own company and builds guitars, are they now building Fenders? Well, Fender might think so because chances are that employee probably signed a non-compete when they were hired, and if they built a guitar that too closely resembled a Fender, they'd probably be slapped with a cease and desist. So when it comes to famous guitar brands, what makes a Gibson a true Gibson? An Epiphone is not a Gibson, a Harley Benton is not a Gibson, a Heritage guitar is not a Gibson, despite being made in the same exact place that Gibson guitars began. It is interesting how brands and brand loyalty are mostly a figment of our own imaginations. The Gibson logo scrawled across a guitar headstock means something. It carries weight. This is why brands like Gibson aggressively defend their intellectual property. And even though the Gibson Les Paul and Fender Stratocaster are both over 70 years old, they continue to be an iconic, sought-after brand, and fans of those brands have some very distinct ideas about what makes a Gibson and a Fender a Fender. Call a Squier a Stratocaster, and you might be in for a fight. Call any guitar other than a Gibson a Les Paul, and some people might just hurl a heavy object at your head. In reality, a guitar is just a bunch of parts. We assign the value and the lore to a brand. It's the brand's history and sometimes legend that shape our view of that brand. If a famous guitar player plays a certain guitar, it becomes part of that legacy. Even negative moments in a brand's history, like CBS purchasing Fender and changing the headstock, can tarnish a brand's image and almost create a fork in the road for a brand, making guitars from Fender pre-CBS much more valuable in the eyes of the customer. I'm interested to know what you think. Let me know in the comments, are all electric guitars just parts casters? What gives a guitar its mojo? What makes a Fender a real Fender or a Les Paul a real Les Paul? Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.